I'm sweating so much in here.
It's very hot. It's very hot.
Sorry.
It's fine. I'm gonna edit that out.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Hello and welcome to the Course Direct 3, the podcast where I ask students about what they study and tell them to tell us a little about it. I'm your host Naufal, and today I have on only one guest, not two like last week. But that's the way the podcast usually goes. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Blaise and I study in Manchester. Study Spanish and Linguistics.
At the University of Manchester?
At the University of Manchester, yeah. I'm second year.
So the first question I usually ask people is, did you want to go to university?
Okay, so did I want to go to... I never really knew. I always knew that university was something that I probably should go to. Mm-hmm. That was sort of like... in school they push like the stepping stones of school, mm-hmm. then college, and then you should go to uni. It's you're doing all of your qualifications to get to the next one sort of thing, mm-hmm. and university is the last stepping stone to get a job. So it was heavily pushed in school and stuff. But I didn't really know what I wanted to do at university, to be honest. Until I got to college, until I started doing English language at college, because I didn't. My parents always said to me you shouldn't go to university just for the sake of going to university. You should go if you really like something, mm-hmm. you want to learn more. And I sort of felt I agreed with that. I didn't want to just waste 3 or 4 years and a lot of money. I reckon in college that's when I decided that I wanted to go to university properly.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
You're doing a Spanish and Linguistics degree now. What was the sort of actual prerequisites that you need to have this to do that degree?
Well, so actually weirdly, for Spanish, you don't even need to have done Spanish at A-level or anything, because you can start off in uni doing Spanish ab initio, which is basically Spanish from the beginning, as one of your joint honours. And then with linguistics, I think I genuinely think it might have been you have to do English language or some sort of English A-level, but it was probably quite a loose prerequisite. I don't think there were very many sort of essential things you have to know, because linguistics is quite a niche subject anyway. Most students won't have really done that in school or college. So the degree does start at sort of a basic level and builds up. First year is the foundations of linguistics sort of. So I'd done a fair amount of that actually in college already. And yeah.
Okay. So so why linguistics specifically then? You mentioned just now that it's quite a niche thing. Obviously I'm studying the humanities now, and linguistics is part of that humanities umbrella. Well, it's a very big umbrella. So it's kind of a subject that a lot of people kind of just they've heard of it, but they don't really know what it actually is. So what made you want to do linguistics? Yeah,
so it's funny because linguistics is quite a niche sort of subject, but in a weird way it's also actually just very vague. Realistically it covers so much, because language is so perfect. Language is in everywhere in society, so it's sort of the initial reason that I was really intrigued by English language and linguistics was because I suppose in a weird way language is a reflection of the way that we live and are just interacting with people. And if we can understand a bit more about language, it sort of gives you a perspective to understand about the way that we live our lives and the way that society is sort of functioning on maybe a very basic level or more minute sort of specific subjects. I don't know, the way the specific reasons that some languages don't have even the colour blue. And that is a result of actually most languages don't have the colour blue. It's basically because there's no need to differentiate between what naturally in the world was blue and what was, say, green, because in a lot of places in the world there are 2 things that are blue: the sea and the sky. The rest isn't blue, so you don't really need to talk about that. But if you have to talk about the different shades of green, you might have a language that say has 50 words for the 50 different shades of green, and then no words for the shade of blue, and that's sort of just indicative of what is going on in that society. It's a very small point,
Yeah.
but it's indicative nonetheless. And I don't know, I found that interesting for a while. I think that's cool. And then with Spanish, I don't know. I've always been interested in Spanish. I always sort of knew I was going to do Spanish with something else. I just didn't know what the something else was, I think.
Right. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So you say that you came to the Spanish first.
Yeah,
so
sorry, I should have said
linguistics.
that.
Okay, right.
Yeah. I think in school, I like, as soon as I started learning Spanish, I think it was in year 9, I loved it then. I was like, this is sick, I want to learn Spanish. I think learning any language, it didn't have to be Spanish, to be honest. That's just what it happened to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's just a sick thing to do, like, I don't know. Like, essentially, that's what it is. And then obviously, it gives you so many, like, opportunities to, like next year I'm studying abroad, and it's giving me a reason to go to Uruguay to live.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't be able to do that without Spanish. So I don't know, language is just cool. They open up a lot of opportunities, make you speak to people that you wouldn't have spoken to before, or wouldn't possibly have spoken to before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I mean, you kind of already, I guess, like, sort of naturally brought us into it of, like, what actually is linguistics. So, like, you talked about, like, how obviously linguistics is the study of languages.
Yeah.
I think most people understand that aspect of it, but then, like, like you said, we speak languages every day, and, like, a lot of it is often just very unconscious. It's just sort of the cultural reality that we are enmeshed in from, like, from the day that we're born, essentially. So I guess for most people, it's like, it's something that just is, but it's not necessarily something that's, like, academic to them. So what is it about linguistics that makes it different from the actual day-to-day contact we have with, like, language?
Well, so the difference between the study of, like, linguistics and then language is, I suppose, the fact that you are studying it. So it's like linguistics is compartmentalized into a load of different subcategories. There's, like, semantics, which is the study of meaning. I can tell you the modules that I was doing.
Yeah.
And then, so I was doing semantics, societal.
Well, sorry. Just before. I mean, if you feel happy with like I guess what you mentioned earlier, would that be like sort of like a general overview, I guess, of what linguistics is, like, from a conceptual.
So, from a conceptual
it's
point
a bit
of
of
view,
a hard question, obviously, but yeah.
It's basically, I don't really know. It's like how to analyze and understand the way that language affects society. It is basically, that is what it is in its essence. You then have different subcategories where, if it's semantics, is analyzing the way that the meaning of words, because semantics is meaning of words, the way that the meaning of words, like, is impactful on both on everything to do with language. So you have, like, the way that grammar influences meaning of words, and the way that basically there's, like, with everything that happens in linguistics, there's one action that happened to something, and the same action is happening back in reverse. So, like, like with language affects society, society affects language.
Yeah.
So the way that semantics maybe is affecting like grammar is affecting semantics. So it's sort of like, because it is language, it is not necessarily one thing. It is I mean, there's thousands of languages. So yeah, exactly. It's also ever evolving, but they're also, like, constantly different languages everywhere. So it's quite difficult to just put, like, box them all into one sort of like category. So you have to sort of figure out. There's, like, ways of sort of, like, translating between languages where you don't actually have to use any specific language. You have, like, a meta language, and that's within semantics. That's what's done a lot of the time, like, through coding as well. So, like, that doesn't really explain your question, does it? I don't know how to answer your question.
Well, I mean, I think you've, like, even if it, I think, like, you have given us an understanding of, like, the difference between linguistics and language, right? Like, if you're studying linguistics, you're not just thinking about language in terms of, like, like, when you learn English at school, you learn grammar and you say, this is the rules, but, like, the reality of it is that it's a lot more social, it's a lot more, dialectical, reciprocal, you might say, like, where you've got certain rules, and these are rules that we understand, but at the same time, like, they're also changing, and that actually it's difficult to actually pinpoint specifically, like, what is language, because languages change and they interact with human society.
Well, I suppose a similar question would be to ask, like, what is society? And then the answer would be, what is it? It's ever changing. And that's probably the same answer with language, because like language is a reflection of society. So I suppose both of those answers are very similar, and that sort of says what. And then linguistics is the study of that. It's understanding that. That's the distinction between the two, I'd say.
Right. No,
Yeah.
I think that's a really good answer, right? Because I think, I mean, as you know, as I mentioned earlier, like we're both humanities students, and like I guess sometimes people can look at academia or academics and they think that it's like trying to decipher truth or trying to learn universal truths, but actually the reality is a lot more complicated, and sometimes academics is actually the process of trying to think about what are the questions that are worth asking, which I think you're kind of getting at, right?
Yeah, well, yeah. So I think it pinpoints the questions that need to be maybe asked by philosophers, but language and linguistics is in itself sort of pinpointing those questions instead of attempting to answer them. It's finding the questions and trying to analyze what questions sort of like about languages and society should be asked for the philosophers then to go on and ask, I suppose. And that, yeah, or like other social science, academia to ask. Yeah.
Okay, so I mean we've really gotten ourselves into like a real conceptual realm here. So to try and maybe I guess slightly weed us out of that and like bring us back down to Earth slightly. We'll talk a bit, I guess, about the specific modules you did. I've written down some of the stuff you said that you did those modules, but I mean, you're also aware, obviously, what you've done. Separate from whatever I've written down. So, I mean, what is one module you'd say you really enjoyed this year, and what you do in it?
So I really enjoyed, for linguistics, I really enjoyed societal multilingualism, and the whole module was basically this massive group project. And it was like this investigatory project where we have to sort of go around into Manchester. So basically, I should explain. Societal multilingualism is basically the way, like the multitude of different languages that are spoken within our society, and whether one person is a monolinguist or bilinguist or multilinguist. Realistically, there are so many languages that are used in society today. And societal multilingualism is studying that. For our project, what we had to do was we got to pick a topic, and what my group picked was the way that accent bias affects employability and promotions within the workplace. And it was a really interesting project to do. Actually, it meant that we were able to sort of begin to apply some of the things that we've learned about linguistics to real life, which was something that is like I feel is quite a fulfilling thing to do. Actually, it's a bit more. It's just way more fun than just reading about it or just writing. When you're actually speaking to people about it and understanding sort of the way their language story, that throughout their life, maybe they've been like a monolinguist and then they've developed into like they've learned another language and the reasons for that. Maybe it's like they had to learn another language or something. But just when you speak to people and actually talk about the way that they sort of the interaction that they have with language, it's quite interesting. It's cool. That was probably the most fulfilling thing about that, like the fact that I could apply it to the real world. So yeah, we interviewed like loads of people working in like all sorts of different jobs. So like some KPs, some people working in retail, some people actually working in the university at the University of Manchester. We interviewed. We tried to get like a range of like across the board sort of spectrum of people that are like potentially affected by accent bias, basically. And yeah, what we found was, and you won't be surprised, accent bias does in fact have quite a big bearing on whether someone will get employed, whether they'll like pass the interview stage, and whether they'll get a promotion. In both fields, yeah, they have a massive impact, which was kind of like, I mean, it was to be expected. Yeah. But for a city like Manchester, which is actually, I think it's the most diverse city in the UK. It might be. I think it's
certainly one of the most.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, true. London might be more.
But who likes London?
Exactly. It's not the north, is it?
No, it's not.
So like I was surprised by the fact that Manchester had such an accent bias to it. And what was also interesting, actually, it was not just like sort of an English accent to like a foreign accent. There were loads of regional accents that were either preferred or not, and that was. It was quite interesting to hear people's own perception of whether one language was one accent was preferable. So like whether like a northern accent was preferable or not to a northern person. What their own ideas of their own sort of accent was. Because you can get into a state where it's like someone is sort of like internally putting down their accent because they believe it is like not the standard English accent and therefore it's other. Which is a whole weird concept in itself, to have an other accent and then the normal accent. It doesn't exist. It's just imposed. But yeah, it's interesting just hearing these stories from people all across the board. That was great.
Well, I mean, if I can ask you about that, I mean, like speaking obviously someone who's not from England, a foreigner.
Yeah.
Obviously, I think around the world, the stereotypical idea of an English accent is like, if it's not received pronunciation, which few people actually speak received pronunciation, but it would be like a kind of stereotypical Southern accent, right? That's what most people like kind of assume the default English accent is. But obviously, being in Manchester, like, you would think that employers are at least quite used to northern accents, like, maybe not super strong northern accents, but like Manchester is often a city where a lot of smaller northern towns and stuff, a lot of people move to Manchester for job opportunities, so you get like quite a good mix of northern accents in Manchester. So it was from like the data you found, like you were finding that actually even amongst employees within Manchester, they were rating southern accents, or people were feeling that southern accents were still rated higher.
Yeah, so I think because employers rate the southern accent higher, that means that people sort of have to like adjust their accent when they are in the interview process to try and suit those employers' preferences.
Like they're trying to sound posh.
Yeah, exactly, that's it. So once they start once that idea is in their head, I suppose people subconsciously create this idea that maybe their accent is inferior because they have to suppress it when they're in like a business setting or trying to get a job. One thing that actually, when speaking to someone in South Manchester, was quite interesting to hear so there was like quite a distinct difference in the nature of accents between North and South Manchester. In North Manchester, it was quite a lot more like local, either Mancunian accent or an accent from the region. But a lot of South Manchester, because I think largely due to students, it seems to be like the standard accent is actually just a southern accent, the normal accent. And like normal UK accent, which like had its own connotations, and the person was talking about that, like they were talking about like how they feel like that they would be more likely to get a job in the north if they had a northern accent than in the south, just because of like the demographic of the people living in the south and how
Manchester, you mean?
Yeah, of Manchester. Like the normalisation of the southern accent,
right? Okay.
has led to it being harder in the south to get a job if you have a Manc accent.
Okay.
Which
That's really interesting. Yeah.
Another thing, our professor was from Africa. He was from Senegal, and he spoke about like the way that the French accent, no, not the French language in Senegal was basically was employed as the accent of like administration and education in Senegal, and that basically led to like an elite class. This was like immediately post-colonial times. Like an elite class forming who could speak French, and they were imposing the French on basically the rest of the nation, who spoke obviously a load of languages. There's so many languages in Senegal, but like the one that was heavily imposed and pushed because it was the language for the government. The Prime Minister had to speak it. So it meant that a lot of people actually in the country couldn't become Prime Minister because most of them couldn't speak French. So it basically led to this ruling class that were fully imposing French on the nation that didn't speak French, really. If they did, it was the second language, and they had plenty of other languages that they spoke. And then this sort of led to like a constant renewership of the ruling class. Like they maintained their status because you had to speak French to be in that ruling position. So it just meant the same families basically ended up maintaining those positions, those social statuses. And it's basically carried on today. Like you need to speak French to have a position of a higher status in Senegalese society, apparently. And I think that's sort of something that we can see happening with English, like globally. It's sort of this use of English as, but whether it's like, I mean, education to a certain extent, and also just like, well, whether it's just the imposition of English on other nations and sort of making it a requirement to speak English in order to engage on this international setting. That might have, like, I don't know, it's going to have plenty of implications internationally, because like what it means is, like, obviously when I go abroad, if I go to a country where I can't speak that language, I'm going to expect them to speak English. Well, most English people do that. I think that's an unfair level of like sort of like, well, it's an imbalance that like, I don't know, like, that is clearly sort of happening and has happened before, and it has terrible sort of implications. I don't think it's not good. It is helpful that people speak, that the world can communicate, but the way that it's being is enforced and imposed, I don't think it's good.
Yeah, the kind of hegemony aspect of it, right? The fact that it's also reflective of power relations and inequalities. I mean, it's one thing for us to sort of invent out of the ether like a universal language for everyone to speak, but another if it's like the result of pre-existing inequalities and existing.
Exactly.
Like,
it's almost actually based off those inequalities, perpetuating them even further. Yeah.
You talked about societal multilingualism. So is there, you also said this year you did semantics, Cold War in Latin America, and Spanish grammar. So any of those you found interesting?
So Spanish grammar was like, it's a pretty self-explanatory module. It's just like, I'm just continuing to learn different grammatical structures in Spanish. Like, it's basically just preparing me for my year abroad, making sure that I'm like at a sufficient level of Spanish for when I move away. So I suppose there's not really that much to talk about with that one. Just no one's gonna care.
Grammar. It's like that's what we did at school when we learned
basic
languages.
It's just like going to like a normal French lesson or a Spanish lesson when you're in school, but for university.
Right. I didn't ask you this at the outset, but you can speak Spanish then, presumably, and how would you say you're fluent then?
I wouldn't say I'm fluent, but I'm like definitely able to like I'll be able to live in a Spanish speaking country and get by, and hopefully after a year of living there I'll be fluent. That's the goal.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Can talk about like Cold War in Latin America, that module. That was a pretty interesting module. We did like a lot of I can't lie, a lot of this was like heavily, we missed so many of these lectures due to strikes that a lot of it was quite like you had to do it yourself basically. It was at home and there was a lot of reading, and I kind of didn't do that much of this module. But the stuff that I did, I really enjoyed. There was one part where we had to analyze this documentary that was made in Chile in between the years 1970 and 1973. It was called the Battle of Chile. It was made by this guy called Guzman something, I can't remember his name, Guzman something. And it was an amazing documentary. It was basically sort of documenting the build up to the Pinochet coup d'etat. And so it was all about the way that Allende was like building up support with the and also the general elections that were that took place. I think it was one in 1970 and another one in 1973. I can't remember, that might be wrong.
Yeah, there definitely was one in 70, but
So it was like sort of like basically giving us a whole overview of the political landscape in Chile at the time, with these documentary filmmakers going around. Like they went to this coal mine trade union talk, which was pretty poignant. It had it was just basically like loads of pretty, like if all of the scenes were were by themselves, if they were isolated, they'd seem like mundane sort of like shots of something that you don't really know what's going on. But the way that the documentary was put together, it created this story of like the building up of the support for Allende, and like the political like problems going on, like what was happening within trade unions and the splits, and like some trade unions started to lean more up to the right, as they were trying to support like. Basically, they were trying to oppose Allende, and then like it built up to the end of this documentary. Like the coup starts in the middle of Santiago, and one of the documentary filmmakers is like videoing the coup, like one of the army trucks roll in, someone jumps out of the truck and shoots the filmmaker. Right as they're filming, and they like fall to the floor, still filming like the documentary, and that's like the last shot of the documentary. It's pretty moving piece. Like that part, the filmmaker died. So yeah, that was crazy to watch. I suppose that sort of in a way indicates the stakes that were at play. Like obviously it was such a pivotal time in Chilean history. Probably South American history as well. I mean, it was like an attempt. It was a peaceful road to socialism. That's what Allende called it. And should I explain like Pinochet and what was going on in like the context of Chile?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we can give like a brief amount of context. Of essentially, Allende was this democratic socialist who was elected and was then overthrown, and General Pinochet was like a very neoliberal figure. Sorry, I'm in politics dude, so I should say it. Backed
by the US as well. That's important. Mm-hmm. So that's why it linked to the Cold War. That's why we were studying it, because Pinochet backed by the US. So many different interventions within South America were backed by the US, if not led by the US. I think that was basically the overriding theme of this module, realizing how many different countries the USA managed to infiltrate and influence. Pretty startling. Like it made me just hate the USA a lot. Way more than I did before as a result of this.
What I'll say is that obviously, like everything you said about this Cold War in Latin America, and I kind of expected this because I had a brief scan through your course page before we started this. And it did say that the course actually does involve a lot of like talking about the culture of like places that speak Spanish, and so and really this topic sounds like quite political.
Well, I suppose through reading poetry and watching documentaries, that is like that is culture. That's arts. To an extent, and that is an indication of. I suppose it is. It's a biased version of maybe what the culture is, what the South American culture is, because it's from the perspective of the artist, and we tended to. I suppose there was a variety of like left and right wing art pieces that we could like analyze, but for me, I tended to. I think it was probably due to the fact that I wasn't. Because of the strikes, I wasn't fully engaged with the module, so I tended to just analyse the left-leaning stuff, which is probably a bad thing to do in hindsight. But at the time, like I was way more interested in that than sort. I mean, I don't know that there was some like there was a testimonial by this person called Rigoberta Menchú. She was from like a tribe in Guatemala, an indigenous tribe, indigenous peoples, and it's basically like a testimonial of her whole life, basically talking through like what was going on in Guatemala, like during all the upheaval of like US impositions. But there was this question asked about whether like the validity of a testimonial by someone, when someone aims to try and talk about their perception and their experiences of a period, of a time, they're inevitably going to put their own perspective and their subjective stance on the situation. So to deem it as fact, it would be a disservice. But part of sort of studying what happened within that period of time is understanding the experience of those people and the way that it's perceived by those people at the time. So I suppose realistically what I should have done at the time that I was actually doing this module is try to get a wide range of like perspectives about all of these about the culture within South America, and maybe I suppose what it is you find somewhere in between all of those different views. You base all your views. You base your view off all of those collective views and find sort of a median in between there somewhere. Because a lot of people tended like they discredited Rigoberta Menchu's testimonial after because it was her perspective of like a big period of time, where obviously if you were living in a different city, you'd had a completely different experience, and like it's not necessarily fair to say that it's not fair to say her experience was the experience of Guatemala. To say that anyone's stance on anything realistically that has happened in the past. To say that is objective would be like it wouldn't be true. So it sort of nullifies the question of whether just because one person's experience was different to someone else's, it's almost irrelevant that they were different. You can understand that they're different and then try and like hear both of the stories and learn from them.
And also the fact that there is that back and forth and that tension, and that the existence of discourse is like I said earlier, like is sort of pivotal to like defining things, right? Because things always exist in a particular context. True. Understanding the context and then I suppose you can then take certain things out of the context as long as you understand the context from which it comes from. That's vital. I mean, so we've talked a bit about Cold War in Latin America. It got very political. So I'll ask you a bit more, I guess something more like pure linguistics based, or like what people think of linguistics. So I'll ask you about semantics. Okay. I have a general idea of what semantics are. It's like when people say you're having a semantic disagreement, it means typically they're using it in a dismissive way. They're saying like, we're not really having a real disagreement, we're just fixating on like word choices,
like
right?
Technicalities.
Technicalities. So what is semantics? Is it really just something that ultimately doesn't matter and it's like actually just a bunch of people twerking up their glasses or something like that?
Well, I mean, the reality is semantics is like really important because semantics is the meaning of words. So technically, when people say that you're having a disagreement about semantics, like it can sound pernickety and stuff like that, but it's also like really essential. If we didn't know what the word microphone meant and we were trying to use a microphone, or you're trying to buy a microphone in the shop, that'd be really confusing. So obviously we have to know what these words mean. Semantics is the meaning of words. It's then broken down into like, you have different word categories. Now obviously you have adjective, noun, adverb and verb, which are like the ones that people sort of like learn in school. But then you have like a lot more. You have like a determiner, which basically is a type of pronoun. Now, a pronoun goes before the noun. So if you have microphone, his microphone, the his is the determiner because it indicates possession. And in language, we have basically a load of filler words that go around all of the essential words to complete a sentence. Now, what we learn in semantics is basically the reason. The order for these, but we learn both the order for all of these words and the reasons that we need them, and the way that these words, like I'm talking about the filler words, the way that these words might differentiate between like different languages. Now, one example could be, so in English you have he walks. In Spanish you have, if you want to say he walks, you say anda. You only need to use one word because the conjugation, basically like the ending of the word, indicates which person is doing the action on the verb. So if you have anda, because it only ends in an a, that indicates that it's a he or a she doing the action. But in English we have to have he or she going before the verb to indicate that. So in one way you like Spanish is able to express the same amount of information as English using less words. like that's the semantics of the two different sentences.
Yeah.
You break down the actual meanings of every individual word, and then you understand how it fits within the sentence completely.
So we've talked about your modules that you've done this year, essentially.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you a bit about studying abroad.
Oh yeah.
So part of the degree is study abroad. You're going to go to Uruguay next year,
Yeah.
and you're going to, live with Uruguayans.
Yeah.
So tell me about that. Like, what does that involve, studying abroad as part of the degree?
I'm studying. I'm doing 6 months of studying in Uruguay, and then I plan to So hopefully I'm going to find a placement in Uruguay for the remaining 6 months of the year. If I don't find that placement, I've got a place to study in Spain as like a backup. But the goal is to stay in Uruguay and be living in Uruguay. But yeah, so for the first 6 months I'm going to be studying. I'm studying at ORT University in Uruguay. And basically I have sort of like free reign to study. Like I can pick any module I want, realistically. This year of studying is like, it doesn't really contribute to my overall degree. It's more like the fact that I'm living in Uruguay and speaking Spanish, because that's the reason that I'm doing this.
Right.
So the actual the subjects that I'm studying aren't really like, they don't have to be about linguistics or Spanish at all, which is good fun. Like I haven't picked my modules yet, but I've been having a look, and there's like, I definitely would like to do some political modules, something to do with like, I think maybe like even Uruguayan politics. I know nothing about Uruguay.
Neither do I.
Actually, yeah, I know nothing about Uruguay in general, to be honest.
Diego Forlan.
Yeah, literally. They won the first and the third World Cup ever, which is a cool fact. But yeah, I think I'm just, in general, I'm excited for leaving the UK and like, I'm excited to live in a completely different place and try to sort of like, really get immersed in like speaking Spanish with people and just trying to master Spanish. That's my goal for next year and the year abroad. I think it's pretty like I have a lot of freedom to sort of do whatever I want in terms of studying, and when I'm living there, like I can't wait to sort of like explore Montevideo and Uruguay in general. And maybe even like go a bit around South America. Like Uruguay's not far from Argentina and Brazil. I'd like to, but I think the goal is really to just like try and like nail Spanish, not nail Spanish, but like really get like to a point where I'm like fluent. I'm able to like be fine living in a South American country and like articulate myself in a way that is similar to how I can in English. Yeah, that's the goal.
Right. Okay, so that was the last of like my main discussion thing. So one thing I ask everyone on this podcast, this is how I, like the last question I ask everyone. Do you think linguistics is something everything should study, or do you think there's some aspects you'd agree that like it would benefit society if everyone had to study that?
I don't think everyone should study it. I think realistically, I think a lot of people probably find linguistics quite boring. But if you don't find it boring, I reckon it's kind of like Marmite. You know how what people say like they love it or they hate it.
Yeah.
I reckon a lot of people probably wouldn't like studying linguistics, but if you do like it, you'll really like it. It's pretty interesting to sort of like to get like just get stuck into. But I can totally see why people don't like studying it. Like with sciences, in school I never really liked studying sciences, but I understood they were like, it's a really cool thing to learn about and it's obviously really important. And like I can understand why people want to do it. I just don't want to do it. I can understand why someone wouldn't like linguistics, but it's got so many pros. It's literally an essential, really. Like linguistics in terms of like when people talk about like, oh, I don't want to learn this in school. When am I ever going to use this in life? Linguistics is like essential. We use language every day, and understanding the way it affects the way that we live is a plus, really. It's a good thing to learn. So I say people shouldn't have to learn it, but like it's cool if they want to.
Right. Okay. All right. So that is the last question I have for this. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And I usually also give people, like, if they want to have any final thoughts, concluding thoughts. It doesn't have to be about the podcast. People usually do make it about the podcast, but anything you just want to say,
Okay, well, talking about like words in English compares to like, okay, in Malay, Are there a lot of words that just don't translate to English at all? Like you can't. There's not a direct translation. You have to like really go around the houses to translate it.
So I don't know if there is necessarily. I mean, obviously, Lusa is a really great example. It gets used quite a lot, and like there's no direct translation. But I think what's often the case with me specifically is that because I've grown up using certain words always in the Malay form, I often don't recall immediately what the English word for that is.
Okay.
But I think it does happen sometimes, but
Mhm.
I wouldn't. You know what I think what is the case with Malay as well is that there's a lot of loan words because a lot of things, concepts that are introduced specifically in the epoch of world history we call modernity, like a lot of them are obviously loaned from English because we simply did not need to develop it until we attained modernity and it was attained, obviously through colonialism.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay. So would it be like what's the word for mobile phone in Malay?
Okay, so you would say telephone, but you would say bimbit, because bimbit, I don't actually know the specific meaning of what bimbit it means, but I think that means like you can bring around. Like,
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that's like the mobile part. Of it.
Yeah, mobile. That's
Yeah.
that's exactly what it means. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay,
But,
I see.
like,
But the
there's no-
telephone part is.
Yeah, that's a loan word. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, makes right. Interesting. Yeah, that's cool. In English, we have a lot of loan words from French, specifically to do with like governance and administration, because like, I mean that during that period of during the 18th century, no 19th century, 1800s, that was a period where we just basically like. The French had like this massive vernacular to do with like administration and governance and like parliament and like bureaucracy and all these words. They all come from French, and like that is a snippet of that period, that epoch of of government, and we've stolen those. We've loaned those words from French, like it's happening now with sort of like the age of like modernity, as you say. But yeah, that's interesting. That's like a different epoch, a different snippet of time.
Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah. I don't know. I have anything else.
Okay, well, yeah, that was fine. That was interesting. Thanks everyone for listening to the podcast this week. I'll be back next week to talk to somebody else.